Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining me from, and welcome to today's webinar on product cybersecurity. This is actually part two in a series of webinars on product cybersecurity regulations, and today we're going to focus on the upcoming EU Cyber Resilience Act, which is coming in 2027, next year. So the question on all our lips is, are you ready for 2027? This is me. My name is Mustanir Ali, and I am the head of cyber product assurance at Element. And I will be talking about the Cyber Resilience Act today, and I will attempt over the next 20 minutes or so to give an overview and an insight into what the CRA is all about and some of the things that manufacturers and product importers can do to get ready for the CRA when it arrives next year. So, the agenda for today's presentation. We'll start with an introduction and a timeline, just outlining what the CRA is all about and some key dates that we all have to worry about or think about in the next sort of year and a half. Following that, I'll then introduce the actual essential requirements, and these are the requirements that apply to products in scope of the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, and also to manufacturers who are responsible for said products. I'll then talk about the reporting obligations, which is actually the first set of obligations that will come into effect under the CRA, and these actually come into effect this year in September 2026. And finally, we'll summarize and suggest some possible next steps that a manufacturer can take in getting ready for when the CRA finally lands. So, without further ado, let's start with an introduction to the CRA. So, first of all, what is the CRA? Well, the CRA is a EU regulation, and it was published in 2024, and it relates to horizontal cybersecurity requirements for products with digital elements. It is part of European CE marking legislation and is law in the EU, especially when it comes into force. The two key dates are at the bottom of the screen, and they are the 11th of September 2026 date when the reporting obligations come into force, and I'll talk about that a little bit later today, and the big date of 11th December 2027 when the full set of requirements come into force. As a piece of CE marking law, it does talk about a lot of typical things that CE marking regulations and directives talk about. Things like obligations for manufacturers, distributors, and importers, documentation requirements, the actual product requirements, as well as the conformity assessment procedures. That is, how you demonstrate that you've actually met the requirements. And these are differentiated by product categories. And product categories and conformity assessment isn't something I'll get into today, but important to be aware that this is part of the CRA. The three big topics that are quite sort of new and impactful for the CRA are the fact that it deals with products with digital elements. That is its defined scope. And that's a very broad scope. In fact, it's probably the broadest CE marking regulation out there. Then the requirements do apply across the product lifecycle. So many of us who have been involved with CE marking until now will be aware that most CE marking legislation only applies at the point that a product is placed on the market. The CRA goes wider than that and applies requirements that cover a product all the way from design and conception through to end of life and even beyond. And then there's the reporting obligations, which are tied to that, which go, again, beyond the scope of just the product itself. So here's the timeline that sort of goes from November 2024, which is when the CRA was actually published, leading up to 11th of December 2027, when the full set of requirements come into force. As mentioned earlier, 11th of September 2026 is the other key deadline when the reporting obligations come into force. There are some other dates that have since passed, such as the dates for various additional documents supporting the CRA, such as definitions of the product categories and a standardization request, which is leading to the publication of something like 40 different standards to address the compliance of products with the Cyber Resilience Act. And the first set of these standards is due to arrive later this year. Some of the deadlines were set as 30th of August 2026 and the 30th of October 2026. Some of these may well be delayed, but we're looking at seeing standards by the end of this year, and then a deadline later in October 2027 for the main horizontal standard, which covers product requirements. So now let's talk about the scope of the CRA. And as mentioned earlier, the scope is quite broad. It's this term products with digital elements placed on the EU market. And this can encompass quite a lot of things. It naturally encompasses devices and physical products, as CE marking legislation usually does. And we're talking about things like IoT products, computers, even components of these products, and also products with certain vertical requirements related to other pieces of CE marking legislation, such as radio equipment and machinery. And basically, all of these products or devices are products with digital elements that make a logical or physical data connection to other products or indeed networks. Now, this also includes software, as you can see on the screen. So software applications themselves, whether that's a mobile app or a desktop application running on your computer, and indeed libraries and components of those software products, and indeed possibly even source code when it is supplied as a product with digital elements that's placed on the EU market that logically communicates with other products and networks would also be in scope. What is also in scope of these products is so-called remote data processing, which is effectively your cloud solutions or backends that work with these software and devices to provide key functionality. Cloud devices and products that are not physically placed on the market themselves are not in scope of the CRA, but where they are providing functionality for devices and software that are in the scope, then these backend functions become wrapped up as components of these devices and software that also need to comply with the CRA. There are some key exclusions then. So, for example, as just mentioned, cloud services that are not physically placed on the EU market would be out of scope. So software as a service solutions, websites and web apps that are served completely remotely through a web browser would remain out of scope of the CRA. The other core exclusions are products covered by other EU rules, things such as products for aviation purposes or marine equipment, medical devices, as well as products for type approved vehicles, that's the vehicles themselves as well as their safety components. So all of these things are outside of the scope of the CRA, not because the EU doesn't care about the security of these products, but because they are covered by other rules that often overlap with what the CRA is trying to achieve anyway. Especially in the case, for example, of medical devices or automotive, the requirements are quite well established and look a lot like what the CRA then formalizes. So we'll move on to talk about the essential requirements, and these are the high-level requirements that apply to products when they are in scope of the CRA. Now, the essential requirements of the CRA fundamentally fit into two buckets, let's say, two categories of essential requirement. There are the first set of requirements outlined in Part 1 of Annex 1 of the CRA, and these are the product requirements or requirements relating to the properties of products with digital elements. And fundamentally, within these requirements, there are sort of, again, two categories. So the first requirement is around secure design, development, and production, including risk assessment. So this is the requirement that touches on the product from the start of its life cycle. Even when it is designed and developed and manufactured, it has to be done in a way that takes into account the risks related to cybersecurity as identified in a risk assessment. And then the second set of requirements under the product requirements is the actual product requirements, which I'll talk about in the next slide. The other major bucket of requirements then is the requirements for manufacturers, or the process requirements. These are spelled out in part 2 of Annex 1 and are called the vulnerability handling requirements. So these don't relate to a specific product, but they relate to the manufacturer themselves and what they must do. So the first requirement on manufacturers is that they produce what's called a software bill of materials for their products, or an SBOM. And this is effectively like a classic bill of materials that you might have come across, but relating to software components, and basically allows a manufacturer to have an awareness of what software components are in their product, and therefore, if they know what software components are in their product, then they're able to identify if a vulnerability appears in one of those components, if that may apply to their product. The next set of vulnerability handling requirements are all about the identification and remediation of vulnerabilities, the handling of vulnerabilities when they become known. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So focusing on the first set of essential requirements, that is the product requirements. So these are specific to each individual product with digital elements that's placed in the market. And fundamentally, these are high-level security objectives or outcomes for a product with digital elements. And these are all intended to be applied based on the risks for that given product. So the first part, which I've spoken about already, is the secure development based on risks. So that means there has to be a risk assessment done, identifying the risks of the related to the product with digital elements, and then the development process takes those risks into account. That leads to maybe some security decisions that are made in the design process to ensure that for each of these essential requirements that a technical control is implemented and that control is appropriate for the risks associated with that specific product. So, for example, we look at things like confidentiality and integrity protection of data and functions. So that the answer to that may well be to implement some sort of encryption in the product for data in transit and data at rest. But that still leaves the question as to, well, what encryption are we going to implement in a given product? What's appropriate for the product? And what might be appropriate for one product with a certain, let's say, sensitivity of data might not be appropriate for another product that maybe communicates or stores more critical or more sensitive data. So the risk assessment is all about identifying how to apply these essential requirements. And it might be the case that for some products, some essential requirements are not applicable. And again, the risk assessment allows the manufacturer to determine that and justify, for example, not applying a certain essential requirement because it doesn't actually apply to the product. To support the application of these essential requirements, there are standards coming. So the standards are at this point in time still in draft, and most of them are aiming to be published by, say, the end of this year, we hope. So the standard for secure development will be a EN 40000-1-2, and that's a horizontal standard that will address risk assessment and secure development activities. And then the remaining essential requirements for the product will be covered by a horizontal standard, EN 40000-1-4, and also a set of vertical standards that identify more specifically for certain vertical product types how to apply these essential requirements or measures that can be applied to demonstrate conformity with the requirements. And these standards are being developed both by CEN, CENELEC, as well as ETSI, the various standards organizations in Europe. The next set of essential requirements then, these process requirements, apply to the manufacturer. And they're all about having a process in place to be able to identify vulnerabilities in a product or its components, and to be able to address those vulnerabilities and to do so in a timely manner. So these requirements, as written and presented in the Annex 1 of the CRA, look like this. But taking into account the draft standard for the CRA to address these requirements, I can reorder them to look a bit like this. And effectively, we have a process, and a process that looks, I would say, not dissimilar to a process for dealing with customer complaints or customer feedback. So you need to have policies and processes in place to sort of prepare the organization for being able to undertake this activity, and then we have a process here. So for example, the first step is to have means to receive information about vulnerabilities or potential vulnerabilities in the product. That's from internal sources, such as by doing regular testing and security reviews, and from external sources by providing information for third parties to provide information. Once a potential vulnerability is identified, then it's necessary to actually verify or validate, is this real? Is this something that needs to be addressed? Is it actually exploitable in the product? And if so, then the remediation step takes place, where without delay the vulnerability is dealt with, and then the necessary fixes or remediations are released. So this process will be defined in the EN 40000-1-3 standard, and essentially deals with how an organization manages vulnerabilities in its products. In addition to the product and process requirements just discussed, there is also a requirement in Annex 2 of the CRA for manufacturers to provide certain information to end users. And this is all information relating to the product and how to report vulnerabilities. But critically, there is also a requirement here for the manufacturer to communicate the end date of the product support period, which means that product support periods need to be defined and then communicated to the users so that they can understand at the point of purchasing, for example, what the support period of that product can be expected to be. So this slide here just illustrates how these obligations of manufacturers map onto a typical product lifetime. So it all starts with the risk assessment, which then relates to the design and development process, which is the implementation of the various controls to satisfy the essential requirements, and then conformity assessment, which is the demonstration that the essential requirements have actually been met. Once the product is launched and throughout its life cycle or its lifetime, then vulnerability handling is expected to be carried out, and that runs for the duration of the product support period, or the period when the product is expected to be in use. The other thing running in parallel to these obligations is the obligation to report vulnerabilities, and that's actively exploited vulnerabilities and severe incidents. These need to be reported mainly to ENISA, which is the European Cybersecurity Organization, and a network of cybersecurity incident response teams. And this is to enable the EU Commission and the EU to understand this general state of product security in the Union and on the market. And these reporting obligations actually continue beyond the end of the product maintenance period, the product life cycle. So let's focus on these reporting obligations now, because this is actually the first set of obligations that comes into effect from the 11th of September 2026, of this year, not that long to go. So these are outlined in Article 14 of the CRA. And as just mentioned, there are two types of thing that need to be reported. There's actively exploited vulnerabilities and significant incidents. And basically, these are things that may happen, and the manufacturer will eventually become aware of them. And when the manufacturer becomes aware of these, a 24-hour period may elapse, after which or during which the manufacturer must make an early warning. They then have 72 hours from when they became aware to make a more detailed report to ENISA and the computer security incident response teams about the nature of the vulnerability or the incident, and what actions can be taken to remediate it, the severity, etc. In the case of an actively exploited vulnerability, the manufacturer will then implement their remediations, hopefully, maybe produce a patch or a fix that will take however long it takes, but should be dealt with some sort of urgency. Within 14 days of that vulnerability being mitigated, a final report needs to be submitted. In the case of a significant incident, then they have 1 month from issuing the detailed report to issue that final report as to the nature of the incident and how it's being remediated and addressed. All of this is being done through a reporting platform, which is being developed by ENISA, and that will allow reports to be made to ENISA and the computer security incident response teams, who will then share that information around the network of CSIRTs, as they're called, based on the details and the nature of the vulnerability or incident that is reported. Article 16 of the CRA is the one that outlines the nature of the single reporting platform. The idea being is that the reporting platform provides each member state or CSIRT, where there's more than one per member state, with their own electronic notification endpoints. In practice, I think this is going to end up looking like a single website where manufacturers can effectively log in and use the platform to make their reports. And the platform, while not available today, is expected to be online by the 11th of September 2026. So do keep an eye out for more information on the single reporting platform. And fundamentally, what you will need to know is which CSIRT to report incidents to and the member states where your product has been made available. Now, this is a very big topic. I have actually done another webinar on this, which is accessible on demand. And by all means, you can explore the Element website or contact me to find more information about that. But some useful resources to support this manufacturer reporting obligations. The first is the website of the CSIRTs network themselves. So from here, you can find out for each member state which CSIRTs, who they are, and understand a bit more about them. And also the FAQ and website published by ENISA with more information about the single reporting platform and these reporting obligations. So that's all we'll really talk about for the CRA today. There are, of course, many other topics in scope of the CRA, many things that we could take out and do a detailed webinar on themselves. What we'll do for now is summarize what I've just talked about and provide some suggested next steps that a manufacturer could take if you are concerned about compliance with the CRA. So again, stressing that there are two major deadlines coming up. There's the 11th of September 2026, when the reporting obligations come into effect, and effectively requires manufacturers to report to ENISA and the CSIRTs when they become aware of actively exploited vulnerabilities or severe incidents. The second topic or deadline is the 11th of December 2027, when all the obligations come into effect. That's the essential requirements themselves, as well as doing the conformity assessment and demonstrating that your products that are being placed on the market after 11th of December 2027 are in conformity with the essential requirements, and then going through the CE marking and declaration of conformity, etc., for these products. So some next steps. And when I prepared this slide, I ended up with 3 sets of next steps, which says that there is a lot to do, but if we are starting early, and attending this webinar, for example, is a demonstration of starting early, then hopefully these things can be done in time for certainly December 2027. So the first thing that there is to think about is the reporting obligations that come in September this year. So it's important to establish some internal procedures so that you can actually fulfill these obligations. If you haven't assigned responsibilities for people, for example, to be doing the reporting and haven't identified the CSERTs, it will be difficult to make those reports. So this does tie in with the essential requirements for vulnerability handling. Of course, those essential requirements don't come into effect until December 2027. But again, a head start on those will definitely support the reporting obligations when they come into effect in September. Moving on then, it is important to prepare your organization. So the CRA and compliance with the CRA is more than just a product engineering problem. It is an organization-wide problem. There's a requirement for the organization to have established or formalized procedures for vulnerability handling and product development. And within your organization, you may well be doing a lot of good stuff and a lot of good practices around vulnerability handling and product development, but it's necessary to establish and formalize these procedures, especially in line with the specific requirements of the CRA. So, for example, doing your risk assessments or having a process for maintaining and updating those risk assessments, a process for updating and maintaining your software bills of materials, defining when you'll be doing your ongoing security reviews for your product, etc. And finally, the products themselves. You do need to prepare your products. And the first step to doing that is to identify which ones will be in scope from this, and that's the products that you will be placing on the EU market from 11th of December 2027. And once you know what those products are, determine the product categories with respect to the CRA and start doing your risk assessments. Start identifying which essential requirements apply, which ones don't, and how you're going to address them. You also need to decide on the support periods for these products and implement your security controls from your risk assessments from the standards you've chosen to use. And finally, do your conformity assessment. And there will be future webinars on topics such as these. But for the time being, I'll leave you with that. Don't forget, we have a free 16-page white paper where we talk about all of the things we've spoken about in this webinar series. So the Radio Equipment Directive and the PSDI in the UK, as well as this introducing the CRA and some of the topics we've discussed today. You can scan the QR code on the screen to download that. And with that very brief overview of the CRA, I leave you. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the webinar chat, or you can contact me. My contact details are on the screen. Feel free to email me with your questions, and I'll be happy to pick those up for you. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Bye for now.